All right, well, welcome back. This is our third session here, titled Home to the World, and this will be a discussion on the world refugee crisis. And we're going to explore, so really this is just a continuation of the second session, but in the second session we focus more on just, the overall immigrants to the United States, and then particularly asylum seekers. And discussing some of the immigration policies that changed throughout our history here. This third session focuses more directly on refugees and what, if anything, can we do about the world refugee crisis here. So before we go into that discussion, I want to revisit the different types of immigration to the U.S. here, and more so actually the different types of asylum seekers to the United States. Now, as you can see with A here, the refugee resettlement process, asylum seekers who are coming in through pathway A, those would be considered refugees to the U.S. They've escaped their area of conflict, have then resettled for a little bit of time, supposedly a temporary time in a refugee camp. Now, some refugees have stayed in the camps for 2 to 3 generations, but the refugee camps are actually only meant to be temporary. But when they come through that process and are able to enter a refugee camp, then they have the opportunity of being processed under refugee status to come to the United States. If you come through pathway B, you are coming on a valid visa here to the United States. You're either coming in as a refugee for family reunification, or you have some other types of visa that are saying that you are coming in seeking some type of protection here from the United States, whether it's for religious freedom or escape from conflict. But you are processed to come to the United States because you would be endangered in your country. A lot of political ambassadors and diplomats would enter through pathway B there as well. Pathway C is asylum seekers, and those are people who are fleeing danger and coming to our border and then requesting asylum once they reach our border here. For a lot of our asylum seekers coming from Central America, they would come through pathway C. They're called arriving asylum seekers. Defensive asylum seekers under pathway D there are refugees who enter our country on a tourist visa or a student visa, but then something happened in their country where they feel endangered to go back, so then they would request a change of status here in the U.S. and hoping that their asylum would be approved. So those are the different ways that people enter as asylum seekers in the United States. The numbers of refugees worldwide continue to rise. There's 19.9 million refugees in the U.S. now, worldwide. That's an increase of 2.75 million over the past 2 years. The areas of conflict have increased throughout the world as well. 56% are in the Middle East and North African areas, 23% from Sub-Saharan Africa, 15% are countries in Asia, and then Venezuela and the former Soviet Union areas are new hotspots in the world that are creating refugees and displaced people. Numbers of resettled refugees to developed countries. We have 103,000 refugees resettled in 2017. So this is talking about refugees who have entered neighboring countries and resettled in refugee camps. Now from refugee camps, then getting resettled to different countries throughout the world. more developed countries throughout the world, like the United States, France, and Australia, and Canada. As you can see, that number has dropped in 2017 to 103,000 people from 189,000 people the year before. So here is the crisis. As the number of refugees worldwide increase, the numbers of refugees resettled to safe areas have been decreasing. Only 0.5% of refugees throughout the world get resettled to a developed country. So as you can see here, just another way to represent the data here. The U.S. historically has resettled more refugees in the world than any other country, but that number has dropped, whereas now the world has, other countries in the world have surpassed the United States in terms of refugee resettlement. And if we look at, and when we talk about the United States resettling more refugees throughout the world, in this last graph here, that's total number of refugees. However, though, if we look at a per capita basis, the United States actually fall well below other developed countries in the world. Canada is actually number one in terms of refugees resettled per capita. And actually, you'll see in the upcoming slides here, Canada is now number one in terms of refugees resettled per capita and total number of refugees resettled. Australia has resettled more refugees per capita than us, and so has Norway. The United States is actually even behind other European nations, and including Russia as well, who has settled more refugees than us here. At 102 million is how many refugees we are actually 102 million. Wait, U.S. 102 refugees per million have been resettled in the United States here. Now these are talking about developed countries here. However, if we looked at just countries that throughout the world that has just taken in refugees, the developed countries have fallen far behind the developing countries. Turkey has the most refugees in their country here at 3.5 million, followed by Uganda, Pakistan, Lebanon, and even Iran at 979,000 refugees resettled in their country in 2017 alone. So in 2018, resettled refugees by the numbers, as you can see, the United States in blue here, Canada in orange, Australia in gray, the European Union in yellow, Norway in light blue, and New Zealand in green. From 2009 to 2016, by far the United States resettled more refugees than the other countries in the world. However, the U.S. has fallen behind Canada and the European Union in terms of resettling refugees here in 2018. And when we talk about refugee resettlement, there's actually different things that we consider and different worries that different people have and that different people bring into the discussion as well. People who have concerns and are interested in supporting the refugees often talk about refugees having lived in terrible conditions, and this is an opportunity to improve their living conditions here. It's our duty to make sure that we can provide just safe opportunity and opportunities for people to live. Talk about the kids and how the kids need an opportunity to have a future for themselves. They talk about family reunification, our human duty to help people in need, responsibilities that the U.S. should take up because the U.S. are involved in a lot of the conflicts throughout the world, and that we just should not sit idly by and watch other people suffer. For people who have concerns about effects of refugees coming in to their local area, a lot of people would discuss that the refugee drives down wage and benefits, increased crimes, increased drugs, the concern about white communities leaving because of refugee communities coming in and driving down achievements in school or wages. the concern about whether or not refugees can take part and be a part of the civic engagement and the improvement of our community. And I've talked a little bit already about the lower academic status, less support for local residents and the local culture that is here, and the loss of language and common culture. These are just concerns, opinions and experiences that people have. We're not here to try to convince you to fall one way or another, but we want to ask, we want you to ask yourself, are there any truth to this, to any of these, or are there any evidence that we can use to back up any of these claims here? And a lot of times we come to the conclusion that a lot of our statements and our sentiments and our feelings tend to be true in part, but not completely true, because the refugee experience and topic, like the topics of all other immigration groups, are quite are quite in depth and in detail, and there's a lot of nuances that go into play, and that not necessarily can come out in with the amount of detail that needs to happen in order to form a true judgment about whether or not refugee immigration is positive or negative. But we'll explore some of these topics here. We look at refugee resettlements in Minnesota, with the blue line being Minnesota here. You can see that we have declined as well, but with the general trend going down from 2005 to 2018 here. The current state of refugee resettlement in Minnesota, 153 refugees resettled in the first 5 months of 2019. At the current rate, Minnesota will be on track to resettle only 367 refugees to the state in 2019. This would be the lowest number here that we've resettled in a long time. Now, with some of the changes in operations for refugee resettlement at the federal level, Catholic Charities, one of the largest agencies to resettle refugees, have actually already shut down its operations here in Minnesota. If numbers are low, more resettlement agencies may close down. There's already 120 refugee resettlement agencies nationwide that have already shut down their operations. Schools and businesses are also negatively affected by reduced numbers of refugees, because how schools are funded, the more students that come to the door, the more funding that usually schools will have to run their program. So when there are less students coming through the door, and we in Faribault have felt this as well too, with the reduction of refugee numbers to our schools, there are definitely less money for the school here, which then forces each school district to make hard decisions in terms of budget cuts and reallocations of funds. So refugee resettlement does have both a positive and negative impact on the school district here. And not to mention that actually refugee students actually tend to bring in more money to the schools than general ed students do, as they bring in both their general ed dollars, but also different grants here that the schools use for programming as well, like the Title I, Title III grants that focuses on students in poverty, and also language learners, integration dollars, refugee resettlement grants, or refugee student funding. Those type of grants come in tied to some of our refugee and our English learners to the school district here. So with fewer numbers of refugees in the schools, funding also decreases for the school district to run their operations as well. And so those are a few points that we want you to consider in terms of when you're thinking about refugees. And remember that really out of all the refugees worldwide, only 0.5% of refugees get resettled to developed countries, and even less than that gets resettled to the United States and in Minnesota. So our refugee population is not as large as some may think. There are a lot of positive things that refugees bring to our local areas. You can witness that with diverse businesses that are in town here. They help fulfill the employment needs throughout the city, as well as add for rich diversity and discussion in terms of our community dialogues, student growth, and learning to become part of a global community. Yes, there are some struggles that communities have to adjust to when a new population comes in, but a lot of times what we see what we see happen is that once the refugee group or immigrant group has been in the community for a while and get acclimated to the community surrounding, they add a range of richness to our community that is really hard to replace with anything else. All right. Thank you. That concludes our third session. The last session is actually a culmination of our discussions here throughout the first three sessions here, and then we tried to answer the question of, we all have this immigrant story, we all have this immigrant history. Who does belong here, and what decides which group belongs and which group doesn't?